Welcome to Ring of Fire. We have a panel full of exciting guests to discuss the topic of society under stress. What happens in it, why it's interesting to write about, and are we predicting anything with our writings? And let's move around the panel here and do the traditional thing and introduce ourselves. I'm Bill Fawcett. I'm the moderator. I also write the number of books on great mistakes in history, with the theory that most of history is driven not by decisions, but by mistakes. And that's probably enough said on that topic. You can find me on mistakesinhistory.com. Stoney.
I'm Stoney Compton. I write historical fiction, science fiction, and alternative history, and the sun is setting right in my window up there. I live in rural Oregon, and I guess I'm retired. Nobody will hire me. I'm too damned old. But happy to be here.
Morella?
I'm Morella Sands. I am currently putting out some books self-published from Word Posse Press. It's me and my friend's press, actually. And also from Ring of Fire, I have some of my alternate histories. So I write horror, fantasy, alternate history, having fun doing it.
Steve.
I'm Steve Stirling. I publish under SM Stirling. I write science fiction, fantasy, a lot of alternate history. Almost all of them are set in places that are under severe stress because happiness is sort of boring and adventure is somebody else in very deep trouble far away. And I have a great time doing it. It's often much more fun to write about it than to do it.
Amen. Shane.
Yeah, sorry, I just dropped off there for a second. My name's Shane Gries. I got my debut novel coming out on December 20th. I'm a career infantry officer in the Army, been doing that for 31 years. And I got a degree in history, so I do have a very big interest in this subject matter and a little bit conversant on a little bit of it. So glad to join the topic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's start with perhaps some historical perspective. Why don't we talk about some of the various periods where there was a stress and different kinds of stress and what effect it had in the real world. And then we'll segue from that into how we've handled different kinds of similar stresses or similar ones in our novels. So, Stephen, what's a period in time that caused where stress on society caused a major change?
Well, going on what I've been writing about lately, World War I. And that was a bolt from the blue as far as most people were concerned. Even the people who started it didn't expect anything like what happened. But then that's often the case. There are those of us who are affected by other people's decisions, and then there are those people who get to make decisions and see the results come out totally different from what they intended.
Okay, and what was the result? What was the change that World War I brought to society? There were so many, but
it led to the Russian Revolution, which would never have happened without World War I as we got it. It filled the Germans with a determination to do it better next time. Didn't work. And it damaged the position of even the victors, France and Britain particularly. Not really many good things came out of World War I.
Especially if you were a monarch.
Yeah, and a lot of monarchies were overthrown. And, even for the people who purportedly did well out of it, like, say, the Poles, the next 50 years were not going to be good. So, and it was all the result of a chain of accidents, bumbling, and bad decisions by a bunch of people.
I read an analysis once that said that less than 20 were actually involved in the decisions that started the whole war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 20 people made the basic decision to go to war in 1914, and all but one of them had VON in front of their names. And the one who didn't was a Magyar, and they don't use VON. So, and boy, did they not get what they expected.
So Shane, what's a period in history that caused change? Why? What did it do?
So I'm a big World War II history nut, and clearly that period of history changed the world and it shaped the world, the one we live in right now. We saw in the wake of the war the collapse of colonialism all over the planet. The proliferation of new nations, the Cold War clearly, but then all sorts of brush fire wars everywhere, proxy wars, gray zone wars. It is really brought into focus a lot of different aspects of how we've proceeded politically, militarily, economically, and everything since then.
Mhm.
I think it's been a fascinating last 70 or 80 years or so, to say the least.
Interesting, as in
In a Chinese curse sort of way. Morella.
Absolutely.
Well, I'll pick something that's not a war. I mean, the Black Death altered a lot of things by making labor scarcer, so people could charge more for their labor, and so they moved to the cities. You see guilds forming. You get like the Reformation and the scientific, beginning of science, and the collapse of feudalism. So sickness can do it too, which we're kind of seeing right now. We'll have to see how this whole pandemic thing sorts out.
And destroy the feudal system by causing a labor shortage.
Mhm.
So the serfs didn't have to stay on the land.
And creating the middle class.
And eventually creating the class. Stony.
Well, I was doing some research earlier today. I was looking at the end of empires, and like it or not, that's what we have, or we are. And the Roman Empire, they just sort of spread out so thinly that you couldn't tell them from some of their neighbors, and it all got cut up into smaller things until the Vandals came along, or the
Goss.
yeah. What I found really interesting was the Ottoman Empire turned into the Byzantine Empire, or was it the other way around?
The other way around.
Yeah, and to a point, they're still out there. They're not as far away from us historically as a lot of the other empires are, and with them it was yeah.
It was the good days, good old days.
Good old days, yeah. And the stress part of it is what I think is what we're dealing with now. Is we have all these stresses from every direction these days, and it's showing.
Mhm.
Well, how? What do you mean by that?
Well, I have cousins who really think that they ought to start a civil war. I told them that we'd done that once, but I guess they weren't happy with the outcome. They don't live here; they live in Nebraska. But
I'm in Georgia. We know better.
sure you do. Yeah, my wife's from Alabama, and her brother. Yeah, it's real interesting. I can see how the Civil War happened, even brother against brother. It's frighteningly realistic.
Mhm. Well, speaking of stress, it's all relative. My grandfather was gassed at Passchendaele in 1917, and I don't think I've encountered any form of stress quite as bad as breathing diphosgene.
If you go back to the Roman Empire that you were mentioning, there's an interesting parallel of stress going on. As the Republic aged and the soldiers were volunteers, one of the things that happened was the campaigns got longer as the distances got greater. And the soldiers, who were more or less draft volunteer farmers originally and small owners of stores and things in the cities, were gone at war longer and longer. They were unable to maintain their farms or pay their taxes. And the land became concentrated and the wealth in the hands of the nobles who had stayed behind. And you got what they're referring to as this great split in the wealth. So that you had large numbers of lower poorer people and a small number of concentration of wealth in just a few tens of thousands in the empire. And it put a tremendous stress on the society of it, led to riots, led to the Marian revolts. The riots led to eventually a turn to dictatorship as a solution. And Caesar was the man of the people who raised the people to support him by promising them to return to the days when they could own things and when the wealth would be promised a redistribution of wealth. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way once he got in power. Well, it did work in one sense in that to raise the masses behind them, Antony divided Caesar's estate among all the citizens of Rome and passed out the money. And that's probably the biggest reason that the other triumvirate was defeated. Rome and Italy was suddenly paid to be behind them. But the stress that that economic situation put on Rome ended democracy in Rome. Would anyone care to draw any parallels? I'm sure none are apparent.
Well, actually, I read a lot of Roman historiography, and they've done a lot of stuff lately using physical measurements to find out things like population and production in the Roman period. And the first 2 centuries of the imperial period were actually a peak of prosperity and population in both Italy and the provinces that wasn't equaled again until the 18th century. They've been doing things like ice cores from Greenland to measure pollution from Roman mining, and things like measuring the size of animals and the size and the height of humans. And things got a lot better between, say, 100 BC and 200 AD than they had been before or would be subsequently.
Actually, about 60 AD when Octavian took over.
No, things were getting better during the Republic too. It was just a lot of violence and disorganization accompanying it. But the population was going up.
Yes, and the wealth, but it was getting concentrated. There were people who owned a significant percentage of the surface of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
One man. So, our host, Eric Flint, is on the line. Eric, I'm on the panel. We're being recorded. Bye. Our host, Eric Flint, says hi. And I'm sorry, I forgot. Whoops. So anyhow, thought I maybe should take that one. All right, so we're talking about stresses like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's turn
I've just
around
spent
now.
the
And
last
talk,
4 years overseas, the last 2 of them in Australia. A year ago, I was a student at the Australian War College. And it's really interesting to see the perspective that foreign nations, especially smaller regional powers, have over our country. And you know, they have often called us the declining hegemon, if you will. Mm-hmm. And they're always wondering why we don't do more, especially in their region of the world. And it was an interesting discussion when I had the opportunity to do a briefing on the United States. And I talked about, you know, specifically from a military perspective, and I broke it out as to where we're deployed, how many troops right now all over the world. And then I put it in relation to our national debt and how we've been spending ourselves into oblivion the last 10, 15 years or so. And I made it clear to them, which they never realized, that yes, there are limited resources in the world. And yes, we are the wealthiest country in the world, but we spend far more than we take in. Our resources are limited. What we can do in the world, our assets are a finite resource. And I thought that it was very illuminating to them. And when we talk about the Roman Empire and how far-flung it was and how the budgets were run and how things got overspent, you know, there's definitely parallels there to look at and some lessons to be drawn from history, I think.
Mm-hmm. And the parallels include some specifics, Shane?
I'm sorry?
Add some. I was saying in some of those parallels in military and economic, the 40 legions versus the whole world kind of thing, or what?
Yeah, I mean, there's all of that, but one of the most important conversations we had when we discussed history and contemporary political, environment is that there's a danger in studying history that you can draw the wrong conclusions from history and overlaying those conclusions against contemporary environments. You have to be cautious when you read history and go, oh, that's exactly what's happening today. Maybe, maybe not. That can be its own little minefield in and of itself.
That's another discussion on history is written through the perspective of the person writing it. Not who was it? Santana said history is someone writing about something that may or may not have happened who wasn't there.
I believe so. Yeah.
And often as not being there doesn't give you all that much of a perspective either, because so much is going on that isn't apparent at the time.
Oh yes, the every general at Gettysburg and how he could have saved the day or should have or did and nobody noticed.
Yeah.
Every general who's there had to write his own book, and every one of them disses every other general, it seems.
Yeah.
Anyhow, they're great reading as long as you don't believe them. So let's move over to putting worlds under stress in our books and in our things. And Shane, I assume this relates to the book you're about to come out. Could you tell us the title, the publisher, and all plug-like things, and then tell us about it?
Yeah, so the book's going to be called From the Ashes of a Dead World. It's military science fiction / space opera. It's kind of far future, but yeah, there's a lot of war in it, which is kind of, my area of interest. But I'm more interested in fictional wars than real ones. I'd rather prevent the real thing for obvious reasons. I've actually been in a real one. They're not that pleasant. For mine, we're just in books and on television. It's far better that way. So yeah, it's coming out December 20th. Eric's publishing it, Ring of Fire Press, and looking forward to the big opening on 20th of December.
Is there stress to a world that causes a change in From the Ashes?
So yeah, I mean, I drew some parallels. I was mining history a lot when I was writing it. And it starts with two empires at the beginning, very similar to England and France, a few hundred years back, and their global competition and power. But eventually one of those empires collapses, and then the senior leadership is spirited away so that they can't be executed in kangaroo courts and so forth. They move on, they stumble across a planet they thought was uninhabited. It is by human beings. But their tech level is similar to 1950s technology, industrial age sort of thing. And of course, there's some infighting amongst the survivors. Do we just settle here and make friends, or do we conquer the savages and bring them to light? And so there's nothing but friction and conflict and fighting going on throughout the entire book.
Okay,
I think it's good stuff.
Morella, in your alternate history, what is the stress on the society and what do you show it's done?
Well, in the books I'm writing, we changed, I say we because Mark Stone and I had the original idea back in the 90s, and we had a lot of lunch meetings over how we wanted to construct this world, and then Mark dropped out. But so the original idea was that we change something in the Civil War, and then we look at what the world is like now. So we had to discuss, like, if the Civil War went differently, what happens in World War I? If World War I happens differently, is there a World War II? Who develops the bomb? Has anybody developed the bomb? So we had a lot of questions like that. But ultimately, the idea is that the United States breaks into different pieces, and nobody really wins, right? So the North looks more technologically advanced, but there's signs everywhere, suspect a collaborator, call this number. So it's kind of a little more 1984. And then parts of the Confederacy look a little better, but slavery only gotten rid of a few years ago. And then part of it is very backwards, still kind of like the 1860s, no infrastructure, whatever. So it's the tension between the pieces of the nation and how they're, I guess, entering the 21st century differently is where the stresses come.
So the stress is defeat or the failure to win the Civil War that changes the North?
Well, nobody won basically, right? So if the thing breaks apart and then everyone's sort of going their own way, we've just tried to find ways that each part of the union that broke apart may look like they've gotten some things out of the war, but ultimately they're not where they would have been if the country had stayed united. So we have a lot of problems with infrastructure and trade agreements and border patrols, and there's just a lot of tension going on.
Sort of like Texas today. Stony,
Yeah.
and what have you got a society under pressure in one of your series or books?
Pretty much all of them. Well,
I'm leaving Steve for last for that reason.
with the exception of just my historical fiction, that's a different kind of stress. I need to preface this by saying I lived in Alaska for 31 years and got a little tired of winter, so I left. There were other reasons too, but I consider Alaska my home. I'm just displaced, and almost everything I write has Alaska in it somewhere. And two of my series are basically about Alaska, and they're both alternative history. The first book that I got published back in 2011? No, it's 2006. I'm sorry. Was by Bain, and it was Eric that got me through the door there with the old man himself, and who said, yes, I'll publish this book, and then he promptly died, so I was afraid it wasn't going to get published, but Tony went ahead and published it anyway, bless her heart. And it's my switch in time happened in 1804. A lot of the people who read the novels, Russian America, that's backwards, isn't it? Anyway, the Tsar still owns Russia. I mean, the Tsar still owns Alaska. Russia is still an empire. The lower 48, well, North America is balkanized. The American Civil War happened, but it happened in 1850. They didn't do a compromise after all. And the South won. So there's Confederate States of America. And after that happened, Texas got pissed off and they seceded from the Confederacy. So there's a Republic of Texas. So it's real interesting. I have a Republic of California and Ronald Reagan is the president. This all supposedly has taken place in 1989. Anyway, the stresses that I have in my story are about the Athabascan Indians and the interior of Alaska who get fed up. I need another preface here. Russia used Alaska as a dumping place for anybody that pissed them off back in St. Petersburg or wherever. So you have a lot of Russian trash, for lack of a better term. And the Cossacks and the Promyshcheniks sort of run things. And the Athabascans finally get fed up and they start fighting, and they get help from the United States of America and from the Republic of California, who help them with arms shipments and things like this. And it turns out the Russians could have easily pounded them into the ground, except it was like Europe in 1914. Everyone's hooked to somebody else. So if you pull a wire here, something pops up over there. And they just, much of Europe and all of, California and others tell Russia, let them go, or we have a big war on our hands. You don't have a little war. And so they end up winning. But I'm working on the third book in that series right now because I'm waiting for something else on my historical fiction. I'm waiting for information to come in from Alaska. But the stresses the main stresses in those stories in that story was the fact that the people got tired of being stomped on all the time. And I think that's happening in many places in the world today. And there are some places, even in this country, where people think they're getting stomped on. They're not really, if you look at it historically, but they're not looking at it historically. I guess it's kind of hard. But anyway, did I answer your question?
Steve, I will just say two words, the change.
Yeah, well, I wanted to do a post-apocalyptic series. I was a follow-up to my Island in the Sea of Time trilogy, which is time travel. And I pulled the rug out from under civilization rather comprehensively, making all the high energy technologies simply stop working. And that puts everybody under a great deal of stress, lethal stress in most cases.
By that you mean the high energy includes gunpowder.
Yeah, explosives, electronics, combustion engines, the whole 9 yards. Very low pressure steam engines like a water engine still function sort of, and that's as complicated as you can get. And wacky, weird things follow. And an original story is set in the Pacific Northwest, and then it branches out later. I concluded that, I think year before last, with the Sky Blue Wolves. Penguin didn't want the series to go past number 15. So I tied up the loose ends, although I left a hook which shows the daughter of the protagonist fighting Cthulhu in a dream. But, you know, that's for another time. Right now I'm working on the Black Chamber series, and that has a lot of stress. One of the things I wanted to play with in that is an earlier discovery of weapons of mass destruction, which happens in World War I in that universe instead of World War II. Not nuclear weapons, that wouldn't have been practical in that period, but nerve gas, yeah, actually that was doable with the technologies available in World War I. And you know, my dad was a professional soldier for quite a long time, and he told me two jokes that he'd heard while he was serving. The first one was a joke from 1942. And it said, define happiness. And happiness is 3 million dead Germans floating down the Volga, each ensconced on a raft of 4 dead Russians. That was the one from 1942. And the other one was from the early 60s, and it said, what is our strategy in the case of a Soviet attack in Europe? And the strategy is threefold, the answer goes. First, we fight with conventional weapons until we lose. Then we fight with tactical nuclear weapons until we lose. Then we blow up the world. And there's a subnote to that one. A tactical nuclear weapon is one that explodes in Germany. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, that was our strategy, and it was a winning strategy, and we won the Cold War with it. And that got me thinking that, you know, war is not an eruption from the id. People start wars. Well, some people have wars started against them, and you're more or less stuck. People start wars, make the decision to have a war because they think they can get what they want that way. They may be wrong. They may be indulging in wishful thinking, confirmation bias, you know, all that sort of thing. But they don't do it just because they want to blow shit up, generally speaking. The thing to notice about weapons of mass destruction and the stress they put on international relations is that no two great powers have fought each other straight up since 1945. And that's one of the longest periods of not having that happen that has existed in the last 500 or 600 years. 75 years without a great power war, it's almost unheard of. And the reason, I think, is the piece of the mushroom cloud. It's very difficult to figure out a path to getting what you want by starting a major war with another great power if they can just blow up the world when they're up against it and they're losing. So I wanted to see how that would factor in if it happened not in the post-World War II era, but in the World War I era. And so you get a stalemate situation. Society's under stress because everybody's competing, but no one quite dares to pull the trigger. Technology advances a bit faster. There's some other stuff in there that also added stressors. And it's stress with no possibility of resolution, which is an interesting situation, I find. It makes for good plotting, but lousy to live in.
No possibility of resolution? What do you mean by that?
Well, you've got 3 great blocks dividing the world, glowering at each other, armed to the teeth, each capable of more or less destroying the others. And they can't fight it out. They can intrigue, they can skirmish along the edges, they can support dissidents, all that sort of stuff, the usual box of tricks. But they can't actually pull the trigger because it involves blowing out their own brains as well. So that puts everybody under a lot of stress. It's a good environment for clandestine ops stories, because that's the main alternative way doing your enemy the dirty when you can't afford to actually fight them straight up.
We've all been talking, whenever we talk stress, civilization under stress, it seems to almost all of our 85% of everything we said twists into a war. Is the war the stress or the result of the stress? Do you get wars because civilization's under stress, or do you have stress because there's a war and there's another reason we're in a war? Does a civilization under stress, at least one of them, is that the recipe for war? And does that mean we should be helping the Chinese and Russians to be better off, or how does that go? Shane, what are they teaching in war college on that?
My gosh, it's sort of like the chicken and the egg question, you know?
Mm-hmm.
With regard to, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, all four of which were enumerated in the National Security Strategy a few years ago as our strategic competitors, if you will. So it all depends on what values you have for yourself, what your vision of the world is. Do you want to help the Chinese when they're out putting Uyghurs in concentration camps? Do you want to help the Russians when they're assassinating political figures? Do you want to help the North Koreans that are starving their people, developing nuclear weapons instead of feeding them? And I could go on and on and on. Are your values compatible with that? Do you help them to grow into something different, or do you try to contain them? And I guess that's the big question.
Well,
I think that drives a national strategy.
Containment worked once.
But yeah, right. And I'm the Army attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Canberra, Australia. That's my job, and I work with the ambassador every day to help contain and deter a war with China. South China Sea, we're interested in that all day long. We're interested in what the Chinese are doing all day long, and we're working with our allies to make sure another war doesn't break out. And when you want to talk about stressors, there's a lot of competing agendas in the South China Sea. You've got nations that don't want to align themselves with either power, like Malaysia and Indonesia, for example. They don't want to align with the United States or China. They want to kind of stay neutral. You've got Singapore, who kind of does the same thing. You've got Vietnam, who wants to be the USA's new best friend. They're trying to get another U.S. Navy base in Cameron Bay right now for another 99-year lease. The Vietnamese are the most pro-American people on planet Earth, as ironic as that may sound.
It certainly is to my generation.
Yeah, it's the whole world's different now. A year ago, I used to listen to my war college mates, my Australian mates, talk about perhaps we ought to align closer with China because they're our biggest trading partner, even though the U.S. is the biggest investing partner in Australia. But COVID turned the world upside down, and now they're closer with us than they have ever been, probably since at least the Second World War.
Since Anzac.
Yeah, and I'm here to tell you, things change. COVID has changed the world, and it's changed it's changed the nature of the strategic competition. It's changed the way the world looks at China. It's changed the way China deals with the rest of the world. They had a really great strategy going on up until COVID happened, where they were pushing soft power. They were talking Belt and Road Initiative.
Silk Road, yeah.
Everybody was like, China's not a bad country. And then COVID happened, and then China started getting a little aggressive. I spent 9 years serving in Asia, so I can talk all day long about Confucianism and how that may or may not affect their national policy decisions. But I believe China, in the Confucian sense, believes they're the big brother of Asia, and everybody should show deference to them. And when people don't, when nations don't, they don't go, oh, I guess your perception of us is not what we thought. No, their reaction is they get mean and they get bullyish. And that is really, since COVID, that's changed the world perception of the Chinese. So when it comes to national,
which is pretty consistent in China, except for the 200-year, 300-year withdrawal period that led to the collapse.
Right.
That, I mean, the
And that's
12th or
part of
11th
their
century,
own
that's the
internal
same
narrative.
response.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
Um,
Morella,
Yep, sorry. Don't mean to monopolize it.
you're not. Fascinating. Morella,
Mhm.
does societal stress lead to wars in your books or in the world? What's your thoughts on that? Or does war cause the stress that leads to society change, or both?
Well, I think both. I mean, if you've read like Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, and he was trying to figure out like how many times people went to war and what kinds of wars they were. He's trying to find some data, and according to what he found several centuries ago in Europe, which is where he basically got most of his data from, you had at least 3 wars of territorial expansion every year, on average. So is that really because of stress, or is that because it was accepted if you were a monarch or had a lot of power that you'd look at your neighbor and think, I'd kind of like to annex that. It looks pretty cool. So in that case, maybe war is the stress because you're just kind of like doing what monarchs do. But if you look at any time there's a famine or something and people need to move and then borders, get stressed, and then you're looking at maybe the other situation where the stress is going to cause the war because there's been something that's been introduced into society like a major famine or something. So it kind of depends.
Steve, Stony, thoughts on society and war? Let's let Stony go. You were coughing.
Well, society, war stresses.
After.
I'm old enough. I was born the day after the Japanese surrendered, and therefore I'm not a baby boomer. I'm a war baby. But I grew up pretty much with World War II because that was so recent. It was very, very fresh in everyone's memory. Every male in my family, my 5 uncles and a number of cousins all served in either Army or Navy. One served in the Navy, everybody else was in the Army. 2 of them didn't come back. And when I was a kid, it wasn't should I join the military, it was which military should I join. I went Navy. But I also realized very early on in my naval career that one hitch would do it. I understand now, and but I've worked for the military since. But the stresses that my father and mother divorced. They were married during the war. It was a wartime marriage, and they divorced in '48. It didn't last long, and my mother and my great aunt, who sort of raised her, they both talked a great deal over time about things that they had to do during the war just to get by. And until the day my mother passed away, she saved all of her grease. From everything she cooked, she saved all of her grease. That was left over from World War II. It was little weird things like that just I didn't understand why they were doing it, but I accepted as that's what everybody did. And then after I got into my 20s and met other families and interacted, I realized that no, not everybody does that anymore. But the stress of having your men overseas from the women's perspective and not knowing if they're going to come back, and if they do come back, are they going to be the same guy that left? Of course not. They didn't realize that then, but we know that now. It changes people. And oddly enough, none of the women in my family ever joined the military. It was that male-female thing. One did one thing, the other thing did the other. So the stresses that came out of that war for our family ended up in actually a number of divorces and some fast marriages that ended up in divorces, and a couple that actually lasted until both participants passed away, or one of them did. And I think it boiled down to who could handle it the best and who couldn't. And looking at one aunt and uncle, and then another aunt and uncle, one who hung in there until the end, and the other one who they split up, and it got really ugly. I realized that the ones that split up, they weren't really good at stress, at handling stress. And they could to a point, and then it stopped, and something had to give, and it was usually their relationship. It was their relationship. So
which leads to an interesting point that Steve can start with, and that is the macro society and stress effect on the micro, on the individual, and the hero and the villain and the people around it. And how do you handle that in your, let's move a little to the writing now. How do you show the society's stress on the characters in your book? Because obviously you've got one very nasty situation in each book.
Mhm.
What do you do with your characters to reflect that stress and how they react to it?
Well, I also try to look back at my own family and how macro events hit the personal level. I mentioned that my grandfather was gassed at Passchendaele. They sent him home to recuperate, well, back to Britain. And he met my grandmother there. She was a VAD nurse. Never would have met or married in Britain before the war. They were too far apart socially. Both their families hated the prospect of their marrying, which became a prospect fairly early. So immediately the war ended, they eloped and moved to Peru because it was as far from England as they could get. And then my grandfather died of lung complications attendant on his gas exposure, but he did it nearly 20 years later, late 1938. So my mother moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Complicated thing there, and that's where she met my father. After her first fiance, who was a tail gunner in a Lancaster, well, the Lancaster came back, but the tail turret didn't. She met my father, they married, hence me. And I was born in Europe because my father was stationed there scouting for bases for NATO air bases. So, you know, the big events cast long shadows and multiply and roll downhill and hit the small events, and then the small events can work their way back uphill as important things happen, like who meets who marries who, who's born, what sort of person they are.
So you do it by basically showing the micro events that are caused by the macro event.
Yeah, well, I like to show some of them at least, like who meets who. Two of my protagonists meet in Black Chamber, and they meet because one's a Irish Republican Brotherhood courier, and the other is an American spy pretending to be a Mexican revolutionary sympathetic to the Germans. And they meet in Germany, where the nerve gas is about to be tested on a bunch of Czech deserters, and that's how they meet, and that influences how the mission to report on what the secret German weapon is, and on a bunch of other stuff as well.
Megan, Morella, as a writer, how do you show the stress of the society in your books? You've got a lot in some of them,
Well,
including horror.
yeah. Well, one of them is one of my characters goes undercover and ends up basically in a concentration camp. So he is rescued from there, but then he has psychological issues going forward, and he actually spends like the next couple of years recuperating physically before he even kind of shows back up in the books, because I didn't think that it would be more realistic than for him to just suddenly, you know, a week later say, hey, I'm all healed up, I'm ready for the next adventure or whatever. You know, I wanted to show that there would be longer term effects on people that the reader already had some investment in, right? So just, you know, trying to do that so that when people are invested in a character and they can see how this is coming out through their lives is one of the ways.
Stoney, how did the stress of the revolution change the tribes in your books?
which revolution?
Alaska,
Okay,
driving the Russians out.
the thing that
Did it affect the tribe's culture?
yeah, no, yes, not really. All of the above. In essence, every book I write is about people and how they are coping with a situation that I create and dump on them or put them in the middle of, which is true with all of us. And with my group, with the Athabascans hook up with the Eskimos. There's 5 different indigenous groups in Alaska. And the Athabascans are in the middle of the state or the subcontinent. The Tlinkits and the Haidas are down in southeast. The Aleuts are out on the chain. And we have the Inupiat and the Yupik Eskimos out on the west coast and the north coast. And all are they're similar in some ways, the fact that they all know how to live in the winter, but they're very different in a lot of other things and how they live, how they hunt and gather and what they hunt and gather, things like that. So since what the Athabascans started was basically a political revolution, they pulled in as best they could all the other indigenous groups. So it changed them to the point where they realized they all had to work together as a whole, or they weren't going to keep what they'd created with the help of the U.S. and the Republic of California, which was also something that's even in the third book that I'm working on now. They're still kind of worried about when is the bill going to come due, because they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. It's also one of the old your enemy is my enemy sort of thing. And they weren't happy. Like I said, the lower 48 is all balkanized, and it's crazy. And everyone's against everybody else. But to change the whole, the only thing that really changed was they sent envoys out and looked at other governments, other friendly governments, and came back and tried to put together a constitution that would work for everybody. And they're still working on that in a third book. So it's not an overnight thing.
So are we.
Yeah, I know.
I'm actually showing taking a historical model, the pressure on a group like a tribe or an organization. In my next book, The Kurds, in about 10 years in the future, under pressure from Syria and Iran and eventually Russia, forces them to create basically a militant state with new technology and turn around and as the pressure of the Chinese and the other tribes and did on what we call the Mongols, created a reaction that the stress of that small war situation created the big war situation and the organization that led to Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. And I'm reflecting that in modern times and letting the Kurds do it because they're the bravest people I know in Asia. Shane might have a different opinion. He deals with a lot, and Montagnards are close too, I'm sure. Shane, we're talking about war stressing, being caused by stress, and then war stressing the people in it. You've dealt with another side of this, I suspect, in the basis of your career, and that is the people, the men and the women who have been stressed by war, and not even necessarily PTSD, just having been there. I mean, first time you're shot at, you're never quite the same person again. Just realizing people want to shoot you has an effect. How does that affect society when they go back into society?
You mean the military personnel when they go back to society?
The military when they go back, the civilians. Many of our congressmen, senators are ex-military or former military or reservists. What effect do you think the stress of war has on them?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, we're all individuals, right? We all deal with war and stresses differently. When I was in Afghanistan, for example, I was a team leader of a team of advisors. I was training Afghan security forces, Army and police. And I had 7 military on my team, a contractor, an American contractor, and several interpreters. And we were all over Regional Command East Afghanistan, going to different places, training different units. First time I experienced a vehicle-borne IED, you know, that was interesting, you know. But you know, luckily, and by the grace of God, you know, none of my boys were injured, and I got to bring them all
those
home.
boys went back, Shane, to America. How are they different, and how will it affect our country? Just as Roman soldiers affected theirs when they retired.
So here's the rub. We have a professional military that's all volunteer, and a large part of that is generational, right? We don't have people from all walks of life entering the service anymore when we had the draft. We have the same families serving. My son, for example, is in the Army. So society overall doesn't really get a taste of it, I don't think. I think society is pretty separated from it by and large. And for that reason, a lot of people don't feel we have skin in the game, which I would attribute to the reason why we still have troops deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria 20 years later. There's no motivation to seeing these things end, and there's no vigorous debate before they deploy. So you do have veterans coming back that are serving in the government, but you've got what, one of the lowest percentages of veterans in Congress that we've seen in 80 years. After the Second World War, almost every person in Congress was a World War II veteran. We have a much smaller footprint now. They say 1% of us serve in the military. It's not 1%. It's much smaller than 1%. That's even including the reserve. So when we come back, I don't know that we have that big of a splash on society overall, because there just ain't that many of us. And that, my personal opinion, I believe the draft should come back with no deferments so that society does have skin in the game. So that before we talk about going to war, we have a vigorous debate in Congress about whether the juice is worth the squeeze. And we talk about what the victory conditions are going to look like. Because we're not Genghis Khan's army. The American way of war is every war that we've ever won, we never left, at least for a century. When we won the insurgency in the Philippines, we didn't leave until Mount Pinatubo blew up in the 90s. We were there almost 100 years. We're still in South Korea. We're still in Germany. We're still in Japan. You know, I can rattle off 100 places. When they talk about exit strategy, that's a different conversation. And I think that's something that we as a society need to have a real long talk about, because military people up front will tell you we live in our own little islands. Our military bases have our own schools for our kids. We have our own shopping malls. We have our own grocery stores. People don't ever have to leave the base or the military post for anything. They don't interact with their civilian neighbors much. They live in their own little world. And when they retire, they go back as civilian government employees working for the military. There is no cross-pollinating, probably the way a lot of people think there is, but I think there's a lot less of that going on.
Why does the
I don't think
concept of
that's
a Praetorian military make me nervous?
Excuse me, if I could just put a little thing in here. I'm the son, brother, grandson, great-grandson, and great-great-grandson of people who fought for the British Empire. And what you're describing is exactly the sort of lives they lived. You know, military was completely sealed off from most of society. It was often a hereditary profession. They didn't expect civilians to understand them, and they didn't like civilians or respect them either. So given the situation, it's more or less what should be expected. You know, Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out the brute. Yes.
Kipling tried. All right, we're coming to the, we've got about 10 minutes left. And let's talk about the kind of societal stresses and the different kinds of stresses besides war that can inspire a change or can inspire a book change or something like that. What changes society besides plague and war? What other things can affect it?
Technology and economics.
Technology and economics, such as?
Look at the long-term effects of cheap, effective birth control.
Okay, or medicine.
Yeah, or medicine.
Living longer.
Yeah.
Cotton
It's
gin.
only 100 years since infectious disease was the biggest killer in the United States or Western Europe. It's not true anymore.
We live.
Shane, you were saying something?
Well, I was going to kind of add on to that a little bit. I think birth control pills have done more to change our society than anything else, along with economics. We're seeing smaller families in the more developed industrialized countries, and it's really shaken up the traditional economic models. Your social welfare systems are not supported. They're supported by a smaller tax base. There's fewer people going to work in the factories now. It's the only reason the United States and Australia are not affected by this is because of immigration. But throughout Asia, South Korea, Japan, China, they're all flipped upside down demographically now, and it's having huge. It's a shock wave that's going to affect the entire world and the entire world economy going into the next 20, 30 years.
It's
They
considered
say
by Japan one of the
70
worst
years
problems the
from now-
country has.
Right. They say
China's on the
70
same
years from
road,
now, the
further
United
behind.
States. Yeah. They say in 70 years from now, the United States and Japan, or China rather, are going to have the same population, because China is going to continue to decline and the United States is going to continue to grow. That's going to have an effect on world politics, on world economics, you name it. Yeah. So it's a fascinating world that we're living in right now, and I don't know that anybody predicted that 70 or 80 years ago.
Morella, stresses on society?
Well, definitely technology. I have Walt Boyes, who's editor at Ring of Fire Press. Talk to my students every semester about where we're going with automation, what the unemployment rate's liable to be like in 10 or 20 years, and why, and how he gives them some advice on maybe what they can be thinking of to try to ride the wave instead of get crushed underneath it. But there's probably a lot of people are going to get crushed under this rising tide of automation, and I don't know how we're going to sort that out. And there's going to be a lot of stress.
Stoney?
Well, one thing we've kind of walked totally around and haven't mentioned at all is especially in this country, the demographic of what race is doing what is going to make a really big difference. It's going to change a whole bunch in the next 30 years. Already in my lifetime, my whole family was white, totally white. I now have cousins who are Hispanic. I have cousins who are part Black, African American. I have cousins who are part Chinese and part Japanese. And they're all, and this is just from one set of siblings, my mother and her 5 brothers and 1 sister. We are integrating at the most basic level you can. And it's with we have a lot of people coming into the country that I think can help us, can really make a big, good difference if they're just accepted. But we're not going to all be white in 30 years. The United States is not going to be a totally white country. We're going to be a variety, really, literally a rainbow. And it's going to be less and less white as we all go along, because that's the way genetics work. But and that right there is causing stress with a lot of people, mostly older people.
Yeah, although a lot of us older people back from the movement in the 60s think that this may be the only real lasting solution to the problem we've been dealing with all our lives.
No argument.
Just a
Racial
historical
bigotry.
note there. In the 1750s, Benjamin Franklin wrote an essay on how immigrants were crowding out the white people in Pennsylvania. It turns out that the immigrants he had in mind were Germans, who, according to Benjamin Franklin, were, of course, not white people. Neither were the French, the Russians, or, he said, the Swedes. Categories change.
Swedes.
Yeah,
The others I understand, but the Swedes?
Germans and Swedes, yeah, were not white people.
Hard to get whiter than the Swedes. But
Neither
anyhow,
were the Irish, according to Benjamin Franklin.
well, yes.
Only the English and the Dutch and the Lowland Scots were.
Well, yes, times are the same and different. Religion. Are we due for another religion? In times of stress, religions arise and sweep through. Are we due for another religion? Is Steve going to have a revelation in the tradition of science fiction writers and create a world-shaking religion?
Uh,
Elrond did that.
Yeah, I've been done. Yeah, I know. Not too well, but he did it.
from my standpoint,
Didn't sweep the world.
from my viewpoint, I went from being a very serious, devout Catholic to an atheist. So I don't think religion's the answer. I think it's just another crutch like all the other crutches. But that's
But
just,
are we due under the stress of plague and war and economic shift to see another religion, or are we going to see it move in a new direction rather than the traditional one of religion with some sort of social sweeping action, or are we seeing it?
boy,
I know we're seeing a lot of decline in religion in a lot of places in Western society. So maybe the stressor will be more in the Western societies in the next 30, 40 years. We'll see religion decline. In other places, maybe we'll see it get some new ground and some new people. And there may be then more stress between people with religion versus those without, and which might be the first time in history that happened. I don't know. Might be very interesting in that bad Chinese curse way.
What stress do you see on our own world? Each of you, I'll ask, and it's just a sentence or two as we run out of time. What do you think the next stress is going to be after 2020? And please, no killer rats or whatever we're going to do on the chart. I've already got all those. I bought all those sections on 2 charts. You know, volcanoes in Aruba or whatever. What real stresses over the next in 50 or 100 years are going to people say this changed society that we're not looking for yet? What's coming that we haven't seen that's going to stress us? Because none of us saw computers and automation, and it changed the working world. Robots changed the working world. What like that is coming that we haven't seen yet? And I'll start with Shane, because are you going to get replaced by a drone?
God, I hope not. They haven't invented a drone dumb enough to do my job. No, I think, like I said, demographics, I think that's going to be a big driver of friction and conflict, especially in Asia and in Europe in the coming decades.
You're an expert there. What do you mean, especially in Asia?
Like I said, the populations in South Korea are shrinking. In Japan, they're shrinking. In China, they're shrinking. This is driving a huge problem with the social welfare net. It's driving a problem with the tax base. With Korea, for example, they're having great concerns over the fact that the South Korean military is going to have to shrink because there just aren't enough 18-year-old kids to fill uniforms now, and the North Koreans aren't going away. The North Koreans all their men are conscripted for a minimum of 10 years. All their women are conscripted for a minimum of 7 years. And those enlistments keep getting longer because of demographic shifts. I think and China is they're pressing their strategic gains hardcore right now, because I believe they only have a 10 to 15 year window left that they can still remain a player before this all starts to reverse itself. They've grown completely dependent on energy sources from the Middle East, which is why that first, second, and third island chain grew up, because all their energy is coming through the Malacca Straits. Their populations are shifting and growing older, so they won't be able to afford the modernization programs for their military. It's all coming to a head. And that's where I think the demographic change is going to push a lot of this friction going into the future.
Okay, in 2 sentences, Morella?
Well, I think people are going to have to reorganize how they think about themselves. In this future where automation takes over, people aren't going to be able to say, hey, my name's Jane Doe, I'm a dentist or whatever. That we define ourselves by our jobs a lot. And in the future, we're probably going to have to find a different way to define ourselves. And I don't think enough people are thinking along those lines yet.
Stoney?
I think the big thing is going to be automation and robots taking over low-paying jobs, and a lot of folks who don't have higher education, which also is not a guarantee against losing your job, are going to be out there with nothing. I think we're going to see a lot of bad juju between social classes, economic social classes in this country anyway.
Bread and television?
Say again?
Bread and television? Feed the masses and entertain them and keep them out of the way? Steve?
I'm going to be science fictional here. You know, we all expected exploration and settlement into the solar system a lot earlier, and it didn't happen. And it's sort of dropped out of consciousness. But I think we're actually on the verge of mass, fairly cheap access to space over the next 20 years. And I think that's going to cause changes that nobody anticipates and no one can predict. It's not the things that people are conscious of changing that are the ones that are just coming up on you. Those don't register on the radar yet. And that's what I think is going to be one of the big ones over the next 20 years. Of course, science fiction authors have a terrible record of predicting the future, even worse than professional futurists, and that's saying something. So we'll see.
Where's my flying car? Yes, I agree. And I see a change coming by the in the Western culture, at least, in the diminution of religion and a resulting change in family structures and family relationships and stability of families and the parent-child relationships. The nuclear family is already diminished in numbers, and I see more changes and more structure, both sexuality and family structure coming that will be reflected by changes in society and attitudes that follow. Or I could be completely wrong and we go back to Handmaid's Tale. I don't know. I'd like to thank all of you for appearing. This has been a fascinating discussion. All of us had a different perspective, and only about half of it was totally scary. So thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed our Ring of Fire panel.
Thanks. It was fun.
Thank you for your service.